Coming days will determine whether this moment becomes a footnote in political history or a defining rupture in the relationship between civilian authority and the armed forces. What started as a classified directive allegedly signed on February 9th has now evolved into a full-scale legitimacy crisis, playing out in public view. Congressional offices are reportedly flooded with calls from veterans, active duty families, and defense contractors demanding clarity. Behind closed doors, senior lawmakers from both parties are weighing options that range from expedited Inspector General investigations to emergency hearings before the Senate Armed Services Committee. The pressure is building in layers: legal, political, institutional, and none of them dissipate easily once triggered. Inside the Pentagon, according to multiple defense correspondents citing internal sources, the atmosphere is described as tense but disciplined. Senior officers are said to be reminding subordinates of their oath to the Constitution, emphasizing that the chain of command remains intact while investigations proceed. That distinction matters. The military does not fracture overnight. It does not splinter because of a single press conference, but morale is shaped by trust, and trust is fragile when questions arise about whether operational safety can be leveraged for optics. Even the perception of that possibility introduces hesitation into a system that depends on clarity and speed. What makes this especially volatile is timing. The United States is engaged in multiple overseas commitments, intelligence, partnerships, and deterrence postures that require absolute confidence from allies. NATO capitals are watching carefully. Indo-Pacific partners are quietly assessing whether American command decisions remain insulated from domestic political maneuvering. Adversaries are watching too, calculating whether internal division creates opportunity. Military credibility is not just about aircraft carriers and missile systems. It is about the belief that when American commanders request resources, those requests are evaluated on strategic merit alone. If the allegations surrounding the February 9th directive are substantiated, constitutional scholars argue the consequences would extend beyond political fallout. The core issue centers on the president's authority as commander-in-chief under Article 2 of the Constitution. That authority is broad, but it is not designed to function as a tool for extracting personal loyalty. The framers created civilian control of the military to prevent generals from seizing power, not to enable political manipulation of operational decisions. The distinction is fundamental. Civilian control means elected leaders set strategy and policy. It does not mean operational safety becomes currency in political negotiation. The Senate Armed Services Committee's next moves will be critical. Several members have already indicated that subpoenas could be issued if voluntary cooperation is not forthcoming. The Pentagon Inspector General's office, if formally tasked, would conduct a fact-based inquiry examining communications, timestamps, and authorization logs. In modern military bureaucracy, almost every action leaves a digital footprint. If authorizations were delayed, if calls were made, if instructions were transmitted, records likely exist. This will not hinge on hearsay alone. It will hinge on documentation. Meanwhile, the White House faces a narrowing set of strategic choices. It can attempt to declassify portions of the directive to provide context. It can frame the delays as part of a broader review process unrelated to political considerations, or it can continue to attack the credibility of the signatories. Thus far, the response has leaned heavily toward personal criticism rather than documentary rebuttal. That strategy may energize a political base, but it does little to reassure institutional stakeholders who prioritize procedural integrity over rhetoric. The 38 signatories themselves represent a cross-section of decades of service. Retired four-star generals and admirals do not lightly attach their names to public rebukes. Their careers were built in environments where discretion was currency. For them to conclude that silence posed a greater risk than speech signals an internal calculation that institutional damage had reached a tipping point. Whether history judges that calculation as courageous or reckless will depend on what evidence ultimately surfaces. For active duty personnel, the guidance remains clear. Follow lawful orders. Maintain discipline. Avoid partisan engagement. But privately, many are likely grappling with uncertainty. Young officers who entered service believing the military stood above political crossfire now witness retired leaders describing a breach of foundational norm. That cognitive dissonance can erode cohesion if not carefully managed. Senior commanders will likely intensify efforts to emphasize unity of mission and the apolitical nature of service. Politically, The ramifications could stretch deep into upcoming election cycles. Lawmakers aligned closely with the president must now decide whether to defend process, defend personality, or call for independent verification. Democrats, meanwhile, will frame the controversy as evidence of systemic abuse of power. But beyond partisan narratives lies a broader public question. Does the American system still contain mechanisms capable of self-correction when institutional red lines are allegedly crossed? Historical parallels are instructive but imperfect. The confrontation between President Truman and General Douglas MacArthur in 1951 revolved around insubordination from a general challenging civilian authority. Today's controversy, by contrast, centers on whether civilian authority may have misused its leverage over operational command. The roles are inverted, but the underlying principle preservation of constitutional balance remains constant. In moments like these, institutions either reaffirm boundaries or allow them to blur. Markets and global observers are also absorbing the signal. Stability of command influences defense partnerships, procurement contracts, and multinational operations. Allies require predictability. If uncertainty lingers, even temporarily, diplomatic recalibration may follow. No ally wants to discover that a joint mission's timeline could hinge on domestic political optics rather than shared security objectives. And yet, amid the turbulence, it is worth remembering that democratic systems are designed to endure friction. Public accountability, investigative oversight, and institutional debate are not signs of collapse. They are mechanisms of resilience. The real test lies in whether those mechanisms function transparently and impartially. If evidence disproves the allegations, reputations will need repair and norms will need reaffirmation. If evidence confirms them, corrective action must be decisive enough to restore confidence. The story is far from over. Documents will surface. Testimony will be requested. Analysts will pass every timestamp and communication trail. Cable news panels will amplify every fragment of information. Social media will polarize interpretations within seconds. But beyond the noise, a quieter process will unfold inside courtrooms, committee chambers, and inspector general offices. That process, methodical, procedural, evidence-driven, will determine whether this moment becomes a constitutional crisis or a constitutional reaffirmation. For now, one reality is undeniable. A public coalition of senior military leaders has declared that the line between civilian authority and political leverage may have been crossed. That declaration alone reshapes the conversation. It forces lawmakers to respond. It compels the executive branch to clarify. It challenges the public to evaluate not personalities, but principles. The stakes are not abstract. They revolve around the integrity of command, the safety of service members, and the durability of constitutional norms that have guided the United States for nearly 2.5 centuries. When questions arise about whether those norms have been bent, the response cannot rely solely on rhetoric. It must rely on evidence and accountability. Keep watching this space. The next moves from Congress, from investigators, from the White House will define the trajectory. This is no longer just a political flashpoint. It is a stress test for the structure of American civil-military relations itself. And how that structure responds will echo long after headlines fade. As the dust settles from today's unprecedented revelations, the implications continue to reverberate through every corner of Washington, the Pentagon, and the armed forces. What began as a single letter signed by 38 military leaders has now expanded into a full-blown constitutional and institutional crisis. Active duty commanders, intelligence analysts, and lawmakers alike are assessing not just the specific allegations about the February 9th directive, but what this says about the fragility of norms that have governed civilian-military relations for generations. Every operational decision is now under scrutiny, every delay questioned, and every political interaction examined for potential coercion or leverage. This isn't theoretical. This is the real-world calculus of national security in a democracy under strain. The broader political fallout is unfolding rapidly. Republican members of Congress face a dilemma: defend a sitting president, accused of subordinating military operations to political objectives, or acknowledge that such actions, if true, cross a line that undermines the credibility of the armed forces. Many are walking a tightrope. Public opinion is already shifting as military families, veterans, and national security professionals weigh in. Democrats, meanwhile, are amplifying the allegations as evidence of systemic abuse of power, framing the moment as not just a political issue, but a governance crisis. The narrative is no longer partisan. It's about institutional integrity. Meanwhile, inside the Pentagon, morale remains strained. Officers and enlisted personnel are keeping their heads down, following orders, and maintaining operational readiness. But the ripple effects of this public break are unavoidable. Trust in the chain of command is a cornerstone of military effectiveness. When that trust is shaken, hesitation can creep into critical decision-making processes. Sources inside multiple branches suggest that briefings and internal communications now carry a subtext. Decisions may no longer be evaluated purely on strategic merit, but on how they will be perceived politically. That subtle shift can have enormous consequences, especially in conflict zones where seconds matter. On Capitol Hill, the Senate Armed Services Committee is preparing for a rigorous inquiry. Subpoenas for documents, emails, and internal communications are expected. Testimonies from senior officials, both active and retired, will be requested. Investigators will look for patterns. Did operational authorizations get delayed? Were commanders coerced into appearances or endorsements? Was there a tangible impact on troop safety or mission outcomes? The investigative process is meticulous, deliberate, and unrelenting. Every timestamp, phone call, and email will be scrutinized. The aim is to determine whether there was an actual breach of constitutional and legal norms, or whether this is a perception amplified by political actors. International observers are watching closely. Allies rely on predictable American military decision-making. If operational integrity is perceived as vulnerable to political manipulation, confidence is eroded. Diplomats in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are already reassessing joint operations, contingency plans, and intelligence sharing arrangements. Adversaries, too, are taking note. Russia, China, and Iran are analyzing every public report for indications of division or weakness, calculating how to exploit it strategically. Military credibility is global. Any fracture has consequences far beyond US borders. The letter's release also raises profound questions about precedent. Civil-military relations in the United States have long balanced obedience with accountability. Generals and admirals are expected to follow lawful orders while providing professional advice uninfluenced by politics. The 38 signatories of today's letter are essentially arguing that the boundary between lawful civilian oversight and coercive political manipulation has been crossed. If no corrective action is taken, future presidents might be tempted to test that boundary, and future officers may struggle to reconcile loyalty to the Constitution with loyalty to the chain of command. Legally, the situation is equally complex. Federal statutes prohibit the use of government resources for political purposes. Delaying operational decisions or withholding equipment to extract political support from military commanders could fall squarely within those prohibitions. Constitutional scholars are debating the remedies: congressional investigations, impeachment considerations, or criminal liability. None of these options are trivial, and each carries enormous political, operational, and societal consequences. The resolution, whatever form it takes, will likely be remembered as a defining moment in American civil-military history. Meanwhile, the public continues to process the enormity of the situation. News cycles are saturated with commentary, social media debates, and leaked interpretations. Yet, amid the noise, the substantive questions remain. Were American service members' safety and mission readiness compromised for political theater? Was the principle of civilian oversight maintained, or was it weaponized for loyalty tests? And critically, will the institutions designed to protect these norms respond effectively? The answers will shape not just the current administration, but the operational and ethical framework for decades to come. Finally, consider the human dimension. Troops on the front lines, commanders making split-second decisions, families of deployed service members, all of them are indirectly affected by this crisis. Even the perception that operational safety could be influenced by political considerations introduces stress, doubt, and hesitation. That is the real cost, far beyond press releases and political spin. This is about preserving the integrity of a military that is meant to serve the nation, not a political party. This story is far from over. Investigations, testimonies, and public discourse will continue to evolve. The ripple effects on civil-military relations, political accountability, and national security strategy will be felt for months, if not years. What is certain is this: the American system is being tested. The chain of command, the oath of officers, the authority of civilian leadership, and the principle of military apolitical professionalism, all are under scrutiny simultaneously. The choices made in the coming days will set a precedent that may define the relationship between presidents and generals for generations. We are witnessing a moment that will be studied in military academies, law schools, and political science departments for decades. This isn't just news. This is history unfolding in real time. And the consequences for the nation, for the military, and for democracy itself will be profound.